Thank you very much. Yes, I'd, of course, first of all, thank you, Vladimir and Mark, for inviting me. It's a really great honor to be here and to be asked to present you some thoughts and results from previous work. Thank you for coming and for being willing to listen to me talking in English. Yes, I also heard about the difficulties of the university, and of course, I don't understand the backgrounds and the implications of it, but I hope that this can all be.
Was political.
Yeah, I would suspect so, but I can only wish you the best and say that this is very concerning for people everywhere when this happens. Now, in the next 50 minutes or so, I would like to present a few thoughts and observations about the social role and impact of gangsta rap as a widespread form of popular pop culture in Germany over the last about 15 years. I don't know, is anyone here familiar with the German rap music scene? Good, then I can tell you anything. That makes my job much easier. But you know that gangster rap is sort of a subgenre of rap music in which rappers' own experiences of the street and in the criminal underworld, or credibly performed simulations of such experiences, are turned into artistic representations, into street stories of what is often termed the violent thug life. They present street wisdom and street morality, and more broadly, sonic and visual landscapes of self-assertion, power, and wish fulfillment, primarily of and for men. Musically, it can take different forms, but I have to warn you at this point that I will not be talking about music itself very much, even though that would be very interesting, but I'll be talking more about sort of a bit more distance about cultural, political implications of that set of aesthetics and statements around it. Gangster rap, as you also know, emerged in the United States, especially in the early 1990s in California, when it branched off the wider family tree of hip-hop genres. And it is a global phenomenon now, a near-global phenomenon, certainly not the newest or the most current or hippest one, but certainly a remarkably long-lasting one. In most cases, those in the know spell gangster with an A at the end, rather than the regular ER gangster. And I think that's sort of as if to acknowledge that the criminal gangster is not necessarily a naturalist reflection of reality, but also an aesthetic, semi-fictional, in some ways playful figure as well, a persona. These ambiguities are among the key themes of gangster rap and its social uses. So the claim to immediate hard realism on the one hand, and a genre intrinsic basic fictionality and sort of the primacy of aesthetic concerns on the other hand. It could also be argued that street rap or Straßenrap in German is the better term, because there are other figures than the gangster himself that populate this genre world. By now, debates about gangster rap and its social and political impact, especially the aspects that are considered negative, have a relatively long history already in many countries. In contemporary Germany, let's say the last year or so, there seems to be, however, a new urgency to some of these questions. I will mention briefly 3 public scandals or outrages from the last few months to illustrate this urgency and the many social and political tensions that surround this kind of music. In April of this year, 2 rappers from Düsseldorf, Kollega and Farid Bang, received the Echo Award in the hip-hop urban category. The Echo Award is the prize given by the German music industry to the most commercially successful musical acts of the year. The award was given to their long-awaited record by fans Jung, Brutal und Gut aussehend 3, Young, Brutal and Good Looking 3, which is a completely over-the-top battle rap-inspired collections of songs which were largely about violating, raping, maiming and killing 2 groups of people, women and other male rappers. Musically, it's said to be somewhat old-fashioned, I believe. This was one of the most commercially successful productions of the year of any musical genre. It went platinum, and it is the most frequently streamed album on Spotify in Spotify's German history. Technically, Kollega, the guy on the left, who has German and Canadian parents and looks, I think, so-called white, is generally recognized as a technically good writer and a fast, but not necessarily all that elegant rapper. His main persona is that of a violent pimp from the red light district. And in recent times, he also branched out as sort of a political preacher of secret truths. Though he, like most rappers, he left the status of these tracks, fiction, realism, intentionally unclear. Now, after it was announced that the award would be given, the controversy ensued during the night of the awards. And afterwards, and I think it indicated a whole bundle of anxiety. In a bonus track to the record, Farid Bang, the guy on the right, a German of Moroccan descent, bragged about his body, shaped as it is, as you can see, by bodybuilding and steroids, using the line, "My body more defined than an Auschwitz inmate." So I'll let that sink in. Now, however shocking we may find this, the provocation in a way seems almost in line with other morally repellent, tasteless sections of the lyrics. I mean, I can't really spare you this because this is what it is about. The two talk, for example, about being so muscular because they beat up so many women, so many whores, or of using women's tears as lubrication when raping them. So you could say that's bad enough, but it was the Auschwitz line that broke an probably even more important core taboo of contemporary German public. And the scandalization of those lines was especially resonant because in the years before, critics had taken a close look at a few other tracks that were published independently by Kollega, Armageddon and Apocalypse, which could be deciphered as anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now, I mean, I could say a lot of how this played out as a result of the controversy and the massive wave of criticism, but also some other backgrounds. The German music associations that put together the Echo Awards apparently saw no other option than to altogether abolish the Echo Awards. They argue that they were not to blame for popularizing and honoring these two rappers because it was the public's demand rather than their own choices which had caused the Echo to be given to this controversial duo. Even the Minister of Justice participated in this debate with a tweet. The two actually apologized for the Auschwitz line. They have now visited the memorial site and so forth. So it's quite a complicated story how this played out. But I'll move on to a different case. A few weeks ago, in late May, the Student Council at the University of Paderborn in northwest Germany announced that it had revoked the invitation to the headline artists of their large annual music festival, the highly successful and popular street rap crew 187 Straßenbande from Hamburg, due to protest by students groups against that group headlining the festival, mainly because of their sexist, misogynist lyrics. And they canceled it because they said because there were threats that there would be disruptive actions against the concerts by protest groups. Again, after the lineup of the festival had been announced, a furious debate took place where different types of critics, including feminists, argued that the Student Council should not lend its support to this group, whose lyrics at times portray violence against women as fun. No matter what the genre and the level of irony, what is said, one feminist group argued in one of their statements. The university held a panel discussion and the Student Council ultimately gave in. Initially, they had argued that those who wanted to censor the group and made the no platforming argument were arrogantly insensitive to the popular music that many, if not most, young people in Germany were actually listening to, and lacked a more relaxed sense of humor. You can see here, that's the group down there. This is a wall of posters on the upper right from the university in I think Paderborn and Detmold, with a quote from one of their songs from 187 Straßenbande, which is misogynist and violent, and they sort of use that as a, to publicly shame them and say, do you really want to invite that group? It says that presented to you by the Paderborn elite of education. Sort of ironically, that's what an elite of education is about. Third brief case, in recent months, large German newspapers like Bild on the left and expert online bloggers and journalists have speculated extensively about Bushido, probably still the country's most well-known and most successful rapper, who in the years around 2005 created a sort of post-migrant gangster figure that many would come to emulate one way or another afterwards. Famously, Bushido is commercially intertwined with members of a so-called Lebanese Kurdish large family, Abu Chaka, whose older members had come to Germany as refugees in the 70s and 80s, and some of their members are infamous for spectacular robberies, and speculations abound as to their role in the drug trade, prostitution, extortion, and so on. Over the last 5 years, various journalists and politicians have accused that family of being a big player in organized crime without, however, reaching overarching judicial convictions. Families like the Abu Chaka were also the subject of a recent high-quality TV series set in Berlin-Neukölln, 4 Blocks, which portrayed a fictional family from Lebanon starring well-known local rappers like Massif and Weisel. Weisel, who plays a particularly violent, hot-headed, and irrational family member, himself has a conviction for violent assault and manslaughter. Now, however, Bushido has publicly broken with his business partner and protector, Arafat Abu Chaka. So this is, the headline is, "This is how rappers break up." So they've broken up, but the question that fascinated the public was whether Bushido had switched his alliances to another Arab-German family, Ramo, which, according to police sources, has recently become a more powerful entity than the Abu Chaka family. So to many people in the public, including right-wing politicians who lament a supposed breakdown of law and order, families like Abu Chaka and Ramo represent something like enemies of the state. And through their connection with rappers like Bushido, they have become figures of popular culture as well. So from events like these, I think it's easy to draw the conclusion that gangster rap continues to exert a very strong fascination to millions of people today, especially but not exclusively young men, and cohort after cohort. At the same time, its exponents continue to test the limits of the sayable, and for that they are publicly criticized and attacked by people who consider it their task to defend and promote political and ethical values like equality and emancipation from a left-wing perspective, especially a feminist perspective, to uphold respect for the memory of victims of the Holocaust, a concern which I think does cross political parties and camps, but also a general sense of decorum and propriety, which is sort of more the conservative critique. And all of this leads to somewhat ritualized public debates and public acts of boundary drawing. This is too much. Depending on one's own viewpoint, these reactions can be construed as necessary, appropriate critique, or as inappropriate, over-the-top moral panic. In either case, we may classify them as recurring acts of what the social anthropologist Victor Turner has called social drama, a calculated breach of rules, then a state of crisis and upheaval, and most of the time then an acts of reintegration, however into slightly differently transformed circumstances. And these dramas are about different matters and different limits and taboos, about so-called integration and its supposed failure, about the self-determination of women and gender equality, about the post-war, post-fascist, post-1968 liberal consensus, with its symbolic center of anti-Semitism. In introducing these cases briefly, I've purposefully mentioned the family and ethnic or national backgrounds of a few of these people. Whether or not that is appropriate or necessary is, I think, debatable, but it does represent an important subtext to these debates. Gangster rap is not an ethnic or minority practice in any clear sense of the word. The biographical backgrounds of the people involved are so heterogeneous that one could come to the conclusion that Steven Werteveck's term superdiversity was invented with them in mind. Be that as it may, in order to move past treacherously clear-cut distinctions between native and immigrant populations or between ethnic groups, the term post-migrant has gained currency in the German discussion over the last few years. referring to situations where the relevance of the so-called migration background is both mentioned, but also heuristically put in brackets, as it were. So the term post-migrant originated in the German context relating to more high culture forms like post-migrant theater, but I'm using it here in a mostly descriptive form. The term post-migrant, as Naika Farutan points out, also refers to a wider post-migration situation in which the culture of the so-called autochthonous or native population has been influenced and affected by migration and migrants in a variety of ways. Now, when we look at this from the viewpoint of a wider popular culture, especially for young people, gangsta-rap nonetheless is arguably the cultural format in which non-white post-migrant men from non-elite working class or petty bourgeois backgrounds are most massively visibly represented, and in which some have the means and infrastructures to represent themselves, I think, which also has to do with the crumbling of the old structures of the record industry. Self-representation is, of course, a very difficult concept here, given the many commercial and genre mediations at play. Of course, the genre rules, this is gangster rap, this is how it works, and in some ways also the business and media configurations of gangster raps with its patterns of audience demand, strongly suggest that post-migrant rappers represent themselves in a specific form, in a specific repertoire. The gangster figure claims to represent tough life on the street, but it is also constructed in such a way as to perform and confirm, or more positively speaking, play with the worst stereotypes that German ethnic nationalists have of young migrant, post-migrant, especially Muslim men, from the proverbial unwillingness to integrate to violent criminality. From the 1990s on, many German gangster rappers have explicitly responded to racist stereotypes by over-affirming them. One track would be Massiv's Wir sind Kanaken. Kanake is a racial slur that has long been recoded into a positive term of pride. But there are many tracks that sort of list all these negative attributes and turn them into positives. For that reason, however, most official representatives of migrant organizations consider gangster rap absolutely detrimental to ethnic relations and are sort of critical and one could also say embarrassed of this form of visibility. Again, such ambiguous formatted visibility, which suggests both restrictions in what can be said and also empowerment to speak, is far from a new problem. But these problems of visibility, implications of cultural luminosities, as Angela McRobbie puts it, have remained with us. I think discussions of this have been very strong in feminist research about sort of the visibility of women that come with cultural visibility that comes with specific restrictions of what you're expected to say. And so this is not new, but I think it has recently escalated. Now, gangster rap remains a part of hip-hop, one way or another. Hip-hop studies more broadly have always dealt with contradictions and ambiguities, but in contrast to dominant voices in public and political debate, hip-hop studies have tended to be generally sympathetic to their object of study, and they have stressed the ways in which it reflects unfavorable social conditions and retains an emancipatory or liberatory outlook. In the current situation, I believe the massive visibility of men from post-migrant backgrounds as violence-prone, proud gangster and battle rappers represents a rather unambiguous embarrassment to the self-described progressive pro-immigrant and pro-immigration camp and their discourses, or ours. Somewhat more pointedly, if hip-hop culture in general has always been seen as a resistant form of cultural production, what exactly do street rappers like the ones I quoted resist, really? In any case, it seems likely that these loud public outcries over street or battle rappers' breaches of taboos can be connected to the societal situation in today's Germany, where migration, integration, and diversity are more controversial topics than ever, where, as you can see from the news, there's a strong conservative backlash to the welcome culture wave of 2015 and 16, and where there are many people who think that they represent the social mainstream, feel like they need to be less liberal and draw clearer boundaries. I think these sort of outrages are connected. In the language of Antonio Gramsci and Stuart Hall, there also is a battle over common sense and everyday ethics and morality. So to illuminate that a bit, or its background, I will try to look at the situation and the cultural politics of gangster raps in a number of steps. First, I will look at the history of hip-hop studies and its cultural political arguments. This will lead to questions about migrant and German masculinity as they are being made by gangster rappers and academic researchers in that context. And then from there, I will move to a specific figure of masculinity that plays an important role in this context in the German situation, the Proll figure. And then I will talk about different social imaginaries that are evoked in gangster rap and about their political implications, especially in the current conjuncture. I guess it's possibly a little bit of a problem that I'll be talking about something that is overwrought with many cliches and stereotypes. And I realize that in Russia currently, in terms of public discourses and press, one could say propaganda-like newspaper coverage, the German situation is often presented as completely out of control and as a complete social, societal crisis, which really isn't my argument. I think that the situation is calm, there's a lot of political upheaval, but it is nowhere near the sort of people don't dare to go on the street. This is propaganda. There are tensions, there are difficulties, and I'm talking about things that are related to difficulties, but this is not in front of a background of a sort of panic diagnosis like it is often being made. I think it's more of in front of a background of diagnosis that this is a normality of diversity that includes conflicts, and that includes crisis situations. But all right, I think you get my point. There's a long history of rap music and hip-hop culture research in the US and internationally. Early writings by progressive-minded academics in the US from around the early 1990s primarily theorized rap music in the context of the post-industrial quasi-apartheid city and its urban underclass, mostly African-American, but to some extent also Latino. Scholars like Trisha Rose, who herself came from the Bronx, where hip-hop originated, argued that early hip-hop may not have been directly political on the plane of content, but that it represented an indirect and creative, both hedonistic and critically reflexive form of counter-hegemonic culture, through which subaltern young people, including women, were able to claim and win cultural space within a hostile environment. Scholars in those years also strongly stressed rap music's aesthetic sophistication in order to counter dominant negative public perception of the new music and culture as funny, ridiculous, uneducated, and so forth. Instead, scholars argued that the verbal and musical techniques of rap music poetically worked through the contemporary urban and media conditions in a particularly innovative form. Furthermore, they argued that it possessed strong continuities with other verbal arts in African-American folk culture. Then, as hip-hop developed and differentiated aesthetically and commercially and also spread internationally, hip-hop scholarship became increasingly intertwined with globalization discourse. According to these diagnoses, for example by George Lipsitz, rap music in France, in Japan, in Germany, and so forth, exemplified specifically postmodern forms of cultural hybridization. So not so much a sense of top-down US-American cultural imperialism, but as bottom-up recontextualization as a result of cultural creativity. Furthermore, according to these diagnoses, it was especially marginalized populations in other countries who appropriated the African-American repertoire of hip-hop culture for their own needs and purposes. This argument was also taken up in Germany at the time, in the 1990s, especially in West Germany, where the contemporary rise of hip-hop culture came to be seen as a case of cultural Americanization or also Afro-Americanization, which is quite interesting because there's a long history of Germans themselves imagining themselves as similar to African Americans from at least the 1840s or so on, but that's a footnote in another story. In West Germany in the 1980s, hip-hop had formed, first in nightclubs in the vicinity of United States military bases, in cities like Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Berlin, and then in youth centers and nightclubs all over the country. These were ethnically diverse, one might say cosmopolitan spaces at the time, especially in comparison to those catering to other subcultural tastes, which were much whiter, so to speak. As many autobiographic writings, but also social research studies like Maria Wurm's Music and Migration have shown, many second-generation migrants at the time, among them the largest group of children of Turkish so-called guest workers, were particularly attracted to hip-hop as they were to African-American music more broadly. But the reasons that people gave for that preference were quite varied. In some cases, the trope that this was the culture of an oppressed minority fighting back, with which one could easily identify, given one's own minority situation, played a significant role. This argument, interestingly, was also made and popularized by left-wing social workers, most of them sort of white native Germans, who worked in youth centers like the Nauninritze in Berlin-Kreuzberg, who provided equipment and training so that second-generation Turkish migrant youth could represent themselves. And the social anthropologist Ayşe Çalar has written quite interesting texts about sort of the role of social work and the invention of minority hip-hop in Berlin. So that is the sort of political explanation of this aesthetic affinity. On the other hand, as Maria Wurm also showed in her interviews, matters of black music's groove, feel, danceability, and so forth were just as important as this sort of transfer of social positions. Also, it needs to be said that generally it was not the case that hip-hop was the dominant music among Turkish German youth. Turkish and American pop music were generally much more popular. Still, at that time, in the mid to late 1990s, affirmative readings of hip-hop culture as creative, hybrid, counter-hegemonic, minoritarian culture gained traction. Many and maybe even most commercially successful rappers in Germany at the time were, however, white middle class and either primarily sort of hedonistic or clearly left-wing identified. There were also legendary rappers whose parents were migrants, mostly representing also left-wing anti-racist viewpoints, most famously Torch from Advanced Chemistry, and the scene included quite a few Afro-Germans or black Germans. There were also a few well-known rappers of Turkish descent who at the time rapped in Turkish and who were commercially successful primarily in Turkey, like Cartel and Islamic Force, which in a way reflects the relevance of transnational connections and also a certain social segregation at the time. This constellation was highlighted, for example, in Ayhan Kaya's study, Sicher in Kreuzberg, Safe and Secure in Kreuzberg, which applied Stuart Hall's concepts of diasporic cultural identity formation, creolization, hybridization, and so forth, to the context of German grassroots Turkish hip-hop youth culture. And he argued that these life worlds bridged a certain cultural nationalism or symbolic ethnicity that was the response to discrimination as a minority in Germany, and at the same time a global transcultural hip-hop repertoire. So while the research landscape was dominated by this progressive narrative with its optimistic and affirmative undertones, in the decade after the year 2000, more pessimistic voices gained traction. Trisha Rose, who had written the influential study Black Noise in 1994 that I mentioned, in 2008 published a much more pessimistic book about the astounding success of mainstream commercial hip-hop at the time, which she called The Hip-Hop Wars, which starts with the telling sentence, "Hip-hop is not dead, but it is gravely ill." She argued that scholars who are sympathetic towards hip-hop in the United States had tended to write about politically progressive, critical forms of hip-hop, which, however, had become increasingly marginal within that scene itself, which was overtaken, so to speak, by commercially calculated, violent, and misogynist versions, which, in her view, primarily catered to the taste of early teenage white middle-class boys, whom market researchers had identified as the prime audience group who would buy music. Other African-American left-wing intellectuals were similarly critical of successful rap artists and the industry behind them. The affirmative meta-narrative of a struggle for recognition no longer fit what was happening in the charts. Similar, more radical claims had already been made in the early 90s by the philosopher, theologian, and culture scholar Cornel West in a brief but influential and I think highly worth reading essay on what he calls black nihilism, in which he argued that economic and political developments in the Reagan era of neoliberalization had led to a, quote, shattering of black civil society, end of quote, and as he put it, lives of, quote, horrifying meaninglessness, hopelessness, and lovelessness, end of quote. And he said that that leads to nihilism, again, quote, a cold-hearted, mean-spirited outlook that destroys both the individual and others, end of quote. This, he argued, was a result of a reduction of social life to market mechanisms and to practices of consumptions, and that which made sure that African Americans, like other groups, were influenced greatly by images of comfort, convenience, machismo, sexualized femininity, that bombard consumers. Even though it wasn't mentioned explicitly, early party and gangster rap formed an implicit backdrop to his pessimistic argument, I believe. In the German context, there were similar diagnoses, or these diagnoses resonated. In the German context, the hip-hop scene had changed profoundly in the early 2000s, when a new wave of younger, mostly Berlin-based, battle rap-tested, lyrically and musically quite skilled artists like Kool Savas, Sido, Bushido, and Flair emerged and achieved a new level of commercial success through different means, including a targeted form of marketing by their label Agro Berlin, in which street and gangster repertoire played a crucial role. So back in at the center and the lower row, there's a few of those artists in the around 2000. One thing that's kind of interesting about their marketing strategy was that they marketed rappers for specific audience groups. So their plan was that Bushido would be particularly attractive to sort of Turkish second, third generation young men. Flair, who has a German ethnic background, which sort of has this nationalist symbolism, would especially appeal to white working class, especially also East German youth. And then there was B. Tite, who has an African-American black family history. He would sort of act this character of an over-sexualized black stereotypes. And this was quite conscious sort of comic figure-like marketing, but which worked really well commercially. Whereas rappers who had dominated German hip-hop in the previous decade had tended to come from middle-class backgrounds and college-track high schools, Gymnasien, these artists now were more likely to have relatively low-income backgrounds and to come from working-class areas of Berlin, educationally from Haupt- or Realschulen, schools that led into lower-skilled job training programs. So in an important sense, they were structurally much closer to the groups that hip-hop originally claimed to represent, the multi-ethnic, racialized, post-industrial urban working class and underclass. And some of them also had a bit of a past as drug dealers and so forth, which were greatly publicized. At the same time, this wave of rap music was quite difficult to integrate into the predominant progressive narrative of hip-hop was all about, which I mentioned. And in my view, these rappers even positioned themselves as rebelling against or confronting these narratives and the camp of conscious and political hip-hop. They did this by being confrontational and aggressive within the hip-hop scene, and of course, lyrically, by more violent, misogynist, sometimes also nationalist or ethnically absolutist lines, relating to the wider world in a mode of confrontational self-assertion, including self-assertion as a krimineller Kanake, like in the Massiv track that I mentioned, rather than critical analyses or stories of victimization. Stories of victimization were sort of taboo in that context. So they did not want to be limited by the rules of progressive, politically correct, subcultural hip-hop. Again, one needs to be careful. This was by no means an absolute break. It was more of a gesture of separation. There continued to be links and bridges to other parts of that scene. There are people in between, like the rapper Alpagan, whose lyrics contained more conventional social critique, and even people like 187 Straßenbande, whom I mentioned earlier, have some aspects of sort of classic social critique as well. Overall, however, the musicians who now came to dominate German hip-hop as street rap were, as I said, more ethnically diverse, they were less middle-class based, and they were more assertive, more self-professed masculine in the sense of tough and dominant. In this logic, interestingly, being commercially oriented and commercially successful and not caring about the unwritten anti-commercial laws of the underground hip-hop subculture was actually a mark of authenticity. So it's authentic to be commercial because those who come from below, those who don't have much, want to make it big. They can't, so the argument goes, afford to be overly moralistic or puristic. That's sort of a middle-class Protestantism. Kool Savas, who's one of, I think, the best rappers there, had a famous song about that. He says, where he says, "You say that I'm not down and dope, that I'm not part of the cool scene, but it is your parents who have a house and boat." So that sort of illustrates that sort of, it's easy to, that argument, it's easy to be anti-commercial when you're rich anyway. At the same time, politically, this wave also represented a shift from a vague left-wing orientation to a much more ambiguous formation, which contained many right-wing tropes and articulation: ethnic absolutism, nationalism, homophobia, sexism. In a broader sense, sort of aspects of social Darwinism. I will get back to that. So this was about 15 years ago. I should also say that the hip-hop and rap music world is, of course, much wider and much more diversified, especially today. There were other waves of other kinds of rap music. There recently was another huge crossover pop-rap hit, Bowser's Was du Liebe nennst, which couldn't be further away from anything gangster. We could go into discussion about the musical changes, but still, as the examples I gave in the beginning have shown, in the last 10 years, artists like Bushido have remained successful, and others like Kollega and Farid Bang still break records. Furthermore, quite a few other younger rappers that had breakthroughs since then followed a similar street pattern, such as Haftbefehl and his Aslak crew from Frankfurt and Offenbach, which include Schwester Eva, and more recently 187 Straßenbande, whom I mentioned. So they're in a quite similar tradition. Now, in academic hip-hop studies in Germany, the progressive cultural recognition paradigm and the diaspora and hybridity paradigm from the 1990s quite obviously no longer fit, or at least they don't fit with the kind of music that I've been talking about, which, as I said, is both highly popular and which provides a massive arena of post-migrant cultural visibility. In my view, these paradigms in academic thinking haven't really been replaced with something new, but if there's one word that summarizes critical academic approaches that emerged over the last years, it is probably masculinity. So masculinity is a crucial concern in gangster rap performances, in songs and videos. For cultural researchers who retain a political commitment to an emancipatory left and or liberal worldview, theorizing gangster rap in terms of intersectional analyses of masculinity is in a way quite attractive because it allows us to interpret these performances of assertive, sometimes aggressive masculinity as a strategy of resistance to racial oppression, which most famously in the US African-American case, so racial oppression, like in the US, denies racialized males the status of men, in the US famously by calling African-American men boys. And then the second step of this argument usually states that this attempt to overcome oppression through the affirmation of a compensatory masculinity reinstates a patriarchal relationship to women, especially women of color. So in the terminology of masculinity researcher Raymond Connell, such performances of masculinity attempt to be part of hegemonic masculinity, but they should really be seen as protest masculinities. Other than in songs and videos, masculinity also emerges as a major concern in texts in which other text genre rules and other formats of reflexivity apply, such as interviews and autobiographies. An example for this can be found in the book We Too Are Germany. Das ist what I show here. Auch wir sind Deutschland, we too are Germany, why it won't work without us and it won't work without you, which was published in 2013 under Bushido's actual name, Anis Mohamed Youssef Fercici, and it was co-written by Bushido and Markus Steiger, a somewhat legendary Berlin-based hip-hop scene activist and journalist, former philosophy student and self-defined radical left-winger. The book was intended as Bushido's ambiguous self-defense against accusations of being part of organized crime, which I mentioned earlier, and more importantly, as a candid critical commentary on integration and migration debates in Germany at the time. So Bushido here writes as a person who knows all sides of the debate from personal experience, someone who is not afraid to call things by their name, someone who understands both formal public culture and informal culture, and who also knows about differences in mentality and culture, and who is aware at the same time that these concepts don't explain or excuse everything. In that book, questions of masculinity are most openly addressed in a chapter titled, "Why Are Germans Like That? And Why Are the Kanaken Doing It Differently? Differences in Mentality." And the sub-chapter on Super Germans and the Lack of Balls, or the lack of testicles. So in the aesthetics of the street rap genre, masculinity is often presented in an imagery of financial, physical, and sexual male power. That's the imagery that also dominates public perceptions. Here in that book, the narrator introduces a number of unspectacular stories from everyday life, true to the form of an autobiographically based sort of social argument book. Out of these anecdotes, a pattern of truly emphatically masculine behavior emerges. He stands up to people who annoy him in traffic, or he stands up to people who annoy him during meetings with teachers and other parents in his children's school. And he defends his, at the parent-teacher meetings, he defends his wife against people who are impolite to her, and he teaches children a clear sense of values of right and wrong. Most German men, on the other hand, he argues, never take a clear stand. They are by far too soft and indecisive, or they get caught up in being needlessly and self-righteously strict about things that are ultimately unimportant. In either case, they lack consequence, decisiveness, and follow-through, and therefore, in that sense, they lack masculinity. They are constantly stuck in puberty. He says, and he quotes that diagnosis from interviews with German women complaining about men in a popular magazine, mainstream magazine, Der Stern. So in that text, Bushido himself emerges as a hybrid figure in a positive sense, the son of a German mother and an absent father from Tunisia, who was also educated by a Turkish stepfather, so a figure who manages to unite the best of all worlds. When it comes to ways of being a man, to masculinity, the text says, quote, "I have to say that I am very glad that on the one hand I have the Arab mentality, which gives me what I feel is masculine. But on the other hand, this is mellowed through my being German, so that I won't become a complete jerk who makes his wife clean the floor even when she's heavily pregnant." End of quote. So that's pretty discursively straightforward. At the same time, masculinity here also is a matter of sort of securely being in the world, of swagger, as the loaded youth cultural term goes, of self-assurance, of something like an aesthetic of existence in Foucault's sense. The critique of German men who lack balls is embedded in a broader cultural critique of an individualistic and cold society, to which he contrasts the warmer Arab social surroundings and networks. Overall, that book is a somewhat confusing text because of its narrative and argumentative structure. There's a stable authorial eye that holds the text together, but it constantly shifts between different attitudes that are reflected in different types of speech. On the one hand, the book performs the aggressive attitude that the author at one point terms Kanaken-Attitüde, a general I'll fuck your mother approach to the world, a willingness to confront and to attack people verbally and physically for no apparent reason, which he calls stressen, to create stress, to bypass any sort of debate and go directly to confrontation. And that is in the text both sort of presented seriously, as that's what we're like, and also with joking, self-mocking distance. On the other hand, and often within the same paragraph, the book argues quite patiently and seriously that we should try to understand each other better, and that we should get over our prejudices and reduce violence wherever we can. In these passages, the narrator observes both mainstream German societal attitudes and the Kanaken-Attitüde from the outside, from a critical distance. So on the one hand, there's one line where he quotes that attitude, which is, "I'll fuck you, Germany." And on the other hand, he says, "I'm proud to be German, yo." So both voices are himself at the same time. In a slightly different move, the narrator in many passages defends his own views on various social questions, while at the same time acknowledging to a certain extent that these views may not be entirely justifiable by standards that can be discursively agreed upon. For example, he writes that given his sense of masculinity and of honor and his religion, he does have a problem with gay men. He says he's not necessarily proud of that, and he's not in favor of violence against gays, but he would not be happy if his son turned out to be gay. When you read that, you can think of lyrics, recent lyrics by Bushido and Shindy and others, where they fantasize about politicians being punished with anal penetration, which they obviously regard as sort of the ultimate humiliation for a real man. So yes, he says, maybe from the viewpoint of readers from the liberal, self-described progressive public, I am somewhat old-fashioned and in that sense different. But, he says, look at yourselves. Are you really sure that German liberals or German mainstream conservatives would accept their gay children unproblematically? Are you really sure that Christians in Germany would be accepting? So if you're not that sure, then why do you think that I do not fit into the society and its values? Why do you think you're better than me? And he goes through similar types of argument when it comes to women's equality and other topics. So in this structure, the narrator moves back and forth between, on the one hand, different positions, some of which he shares and argues for, and others that he merely describes or that he scandalizes and problematizes. And then also between his own overall subject position and that of an imagined reader, who is ultimately invited to see through the hypocrisies of mainstream society. So you could argue that that's a contradiction, it's a means of creating confusion, but it does allow the book to articulate a spirited, if resentful, cultural and social critique of German culture and society. One could, of course, also say that it's basically the result of a dialogue between the two people who have written the book, which probably also isn't completely wrong, but that's not the entire story either. I think that these ambiguities result from the attempt to reconcile two forms of discourse that are actually quite difficult or even impossible to reconcile. Gangsta-рэп with its signature rudeness, its confrontational nature, and its skepticism against reasonable conversation on the one hand, and public political discourse with its postulates of rationality and ethical orientation. So I have just 3 points to make there. The first is that I think that this ambiguity is not only a matter of autobiographical books like that. This seeming confusion of voices is actually indicative of a broader pattern, which, for example, also emerges in ethnographic interviews, where people switch between those different kinds of self-presentation. Secondly, we should not lose sight of the basic critique that is being articulated here, which goes like this. You, reader, think that you don't like me, Bushido, because I am what you perceive as aggressive and loud, because I show what I have in a way that you think is vulgar, because I carry myself as a man in the way that I see fit, because I have opinions that you think are incompatible with liberal German society. But really, the actual reason why you don't like me and why you don't accept me is because you aren't ready to accept the Muslim son of a working class immigrant without much formal education, who is more wealthy, more attractive, and more powerful than you are. Everything else is just window dressing. So on Bushido and Steiger's part, this is an attempt, I think, to deflect political critique by employing a critique of moralism. In this view, ultimately well-off, liberal, anti-sexist, and professedly anti-racist Germans use their moralism to exclude those they don't like really for other reasons. Third, these observations I think also lead to a number of methodological questions about the status of statements about masculinity like the ones that I quoted. What do we make of such statements, really? Do they represent something like an actual cultural pattern, a structure of feeling, of lived experiences? Do they primarily represent a pop cultural fantasy? Or are they more something like a critical argument in a specific situation about how one should live that is made under the circumstances of specific other arguments that are experienced and imagined, which would be a completely different kind of statement from one that sort of really describes a deeply felt sense of how one should behave in general. So when we come back to the academic research on gangsta-raps and its politics, these questions can be translated as matters that lead to questions of method. If we want to understand the social significance of street rap and the formations of which it is part, we cannot do so simply by looking at the music, the lyrics, or by looking at statements like these, nor can we understand it only through interviewing and media impact studies. Instead, we need a sort of ethnographic cultural analysis approach that brings these perspectives together, which, of course, is much easier said than done. A few years ago, I attempted an ethnographic study for which I met many people who listened to similar music and wore a youth cultural fashion style that was associated with Berlin street and gangster rap. The study, which came out in 2013, was titled A Prole with Class, or a Classy Prole, Fashion, Pop Culture and Social Inequality Among Young Men in Berlin. For that study, my main interest were the ways in which people related to stereotypes or cultural figures of lower class masculinity, especially the figure Proll, or Prole in English, mainly by looking at clothing and a specific clothing and body style that many people at the time called Proll style or Prolliger style. It was closely associated with gangster rap because people like Bushido embodied and promoted it. So it's quite interesting that that wave of street rap around 2000 was termed by many people outside that scene as a Verprollung, as sort of a symbolic proletarianization of the hip-hop world. So a term that was mostly used with negative, pejorative connotations. The German figure Proll has a long history, but became redefined in recent decades. It is primarily a cultural and aesthetic term that derives from being lower class economically, from, as you know, proletarian. From the 19th century on, similar abbreviations like Prolet and Proletenhaft clearly referred to the working class, and just as importantly, they carried cultural connotations of being coarse, uncivilized, overly direct, which are typical for the middle and upper classes' view of those below them in the social structure. So prolet had always been a cultural classification that creates homologies between aesthetic and bodily differences and social positionalities. Of course, in the context of the socialist and communist labor and political movement, the term prolet gained much more positive meanings. Increasingly, since the 1970s, the words Proll and Prollig have referred to forms of behavior that were only loosely or indirectly connected with working classness. In that process, the Proll increasingly came to be seen as a caricature of sexist, self-assertive, loud men. But as I said, the term was not used in reference specifically to the working class, but also, for example, to the nouveau riche, the newly rich. So in what we could call the cultural imaginary, in films, music, and so forth, the stereotypical Proll figure also moved from connotations of the left-wing proletarian to a sexist and more right-wing Proll figure. So while over those last 40 years, ideals of gender polarity and also of masculinity shifted significantly in parts, especially of the middle class, which tends to dominate much of German society, and these shifts were partly due to the influence of feminism, the Proll figure became something like a residual category onto which supposedly archaic tendencies and behavior were projected. So we can look at that on the level of stereotypes and ascriptions and cultural classifications, but you could also argue that this loosely relates to diverging models and ideologies of gender and family relationships, where the belief in gender dichotomies or polarities and hierarchies is, as some sociologists have argued, strongest in the working class and in the elite upper class, but less so in the educated Bildungsbürgertum middle class, especially since the 1970s in Germany. While then the usage of the term Proll in recent times primarily has a behavioral focus, so there's even the verb prollen, which means showing off, being loud, also being sort of cheaply sexual, but which anybody when they're in the right mood or drunk or letting go, they proll, sie prollen rum. At the same time, that does not mean, or you could say, wow, you have an Apple computer, that's really prollig because it's showing off that you can afford an Apple computer. But at the same time, that does not mean that class connotations and discriminatory implications have completely died out. They still resonate. This is particularly obvious in youth subcultures where, I believe, especially since the 1980s, there often is a subdivision between the sophisticated part of the scene and the prolic part of the scene, between, for example, art punk and prol punk, between emo-core and prol hardcore, between the 90s intelligent techno and prol techno, and in some sense between sort of conscious rap and prol rap on the other side. The prol figure was for a long time seen as implicitly white, but in the 1990s and the years after 2000, the term was increasingly used to refer to people with a background of migration as well. In the context of street rap around 2000 to 2010, the term prol was appropriated and turned into a positive self-description, like many similar terms, the racist term Kanake in German, the N-word in American English. But still these sort of resignifications, it is my observation from interviews and so forth, remained somewhat unstable and defiant, so it was not easy to resignify the term. In their everyday interactions and in interviews, people strongly relied on terms like gangsta, prol, Kanake in describing themselves and others, but at the same time employed a considerable amount of humor and reflexivity in relationship to these cultural figures. So this self-aware prollige clothing style, partly through music and partly through other forms of urban interaction, was created in, well, it's arguable, but the people from Kreuzberg would say that it was created in Kreuzberg, the center of the world, and then spread from post-migrant young men of Turkish and Arab descent in former West Berlin to the working class, post-working class, white German and also Eastern European neighborhoods like Lichtenberg, Hohenschönhausen and Marzahn in former East Berlin. And then to other regions of the city and the country. I call this process transversal diffusion. Just to illustrate the point, this clothing style, Bushido here on the upper right, he embodies it perfectly, and his whole argument was that young guys from the street, the drug pushers, the real street tough guys in Berlin, this is the style that they wear. They don't disguise themselves with baggy pants and white and long American clothing. That's the real style. So anybody who costumes themselves in sort of hip-hop outfits is really just putting on a costume, whereas this is real authentic street masculinity. And then the company, which is a small Berlin-based company, tried to use that in their marketing quite a bit, and of course paid people to rap about them and so forth, and that's how the style spread. In that process, a new social and cultural formation, I think, emerged that is culturally and sociologically quite interesting, and that first of all must be seen as a youth cultural taste community, so through shared tastes in clothing and also to some extent in music. The term community is, of course, quite problematic here. There are no organic ties. People didn't have common institutions or a truly common self-image. There was actually quite a lot of animosity between them due to sort of territorial identity constructions and racism. So people of a Turkish background in Kreuzberg and the white East German from Lichtenberg would have very similar tastes, very similar outfits, but would still sort of utter, say, racist things against each other. So they were not sort of a community of people in their own in their own understanding necessarily, but still. Not only stylistically, but also economically, and in terms of educational trajectories and degrees, there were strong similarities between the people who wore different versions of this style across ethnicities. Maps are always a weird thing, but I tried to map the stores that sold clothing of that type and put that onto a map of the atlas of unemployment statistics. So the reddest areas are those with the highest unemployment numbers in Berlin. And it's quite interesting that these stores really popped up often in those areas. Not always, not entirely, but there's somewhat of a pattern. In my view, what turned these scattered taste practices into something more than a mere pattern of taste affinities were the common cultural antagonisms that characterized these style practices and the justifications given for them. They were characterized by strong opposition towards the tastes and attitudes of the educated, white, predominantly West German middle class, especially against its so-called post-materialist faction, and against the educational institutions that are dominated by that group. So that includes anti-intellectualism, it includes anti-political correctness sentiments, and a quite strong dislike of so-called alternative or hippie-inspired left-wing youth and university student culture. I had some interesting interviews with people where I was walking through the city with people, and then they saw people walk by who I thought, actually, I kind of looked similar to that a few years ago, and one of my, the people I worked with sort of spat on the floor and said, I would rather kill myself than look like that. So in doing so, some people identified with or self-figured themselves as figures like the gangster or Proll in very playful ways, while others seemed deadly serious. More generally speaking, people's relationship to pop cultural figures, as they are seen by others and sometimes themselves, I think that they sort of shift or oscillate between two poles, between being and performing, between being gangster and performing gangster. In German, there's the often used term auf Gangster machen. This tension was an important cultural theme in the music and its lyrics, but also in everyday actions and in comments that people made about others whom they observed and so on. So those were a few of the conclusions that I arrived at a few years ago before the recent scandals that I mentioned in my introduction. Looking at these matters again today, it seems to me that some of these recent developments are primarily continuations and in some ways escalations of what had taken place 10 years earlier. In 2015, for example, two rappers from 187 Straßenbande, Jesus and Maxwell, so that's the group that was disinvited from Paderborn. They released a track called Prolls, a track that basically repeats all the tropes that I wrote about a few years earlier. It's all about being a proud, masculine Proll through practices of consumption, hedonism, and display, fast cars, bundles of cash, loud speakers, subwoofers, sexual intercourse, doggy style only, gold chains, expensive watches, tropical holidays, drug deals, a red light fetish, and all of that in really simple sort of declarative language. I thought about showing you the video, but then I thought that it would be weird if a room full of academics sat around a room and looked at a video that was mainly about men looking at women's body parts. So I'll leave that out and I'll just quote a few lyrics. One was, ich kaufe ein paar Sachen, auch ein paar Waffen. Wieso? Einfach nur so, um den Lauten zu machen. I buy some stuff, I buy some guns. Why? For no reason, just to act like the loud guy. Ich bin ein Proll und ich zeige, was ich habe. I'm a Proll and I show what I've got. Wir sind Prolls, was du nicht sagst. Sie nennen uns Angeber. We are Prolls. You don't say. They call us Show-offs. Yeah, ich bin ein Proll. Das ist alles so gewollt. Yeah, I am a Proll. All of this is how we want it to be. So in lyrics like these, there often is an interesting tension between, on the one hand, proudly being a Proll. Ja, ich bin ein Proll. And on the other hand, merely acting like and performing as a Proll for purposes of impression management and amusement. Einfach nur so, just I do that for no reason, just to act like the loud guy. So Jesus and Maxwell also stress quite strongly that they are being Prolls and acting as Prolls intentionally, not accidentally. Das ist alles so gewollt. Es ist alles wie es soll. So all of this is how we want it to be. Everything is like it should be. So this, I think, quite clearly implies a dialogue with outsiders, those who call them show-offs. Outsiders who believe that people like these two rappers from the urban post-migrant subproletariat simply cannot help themselves, that they would like to have what these outsiders consider good taste, but that they fail because they are culturally incompetent. To the contrary, they announce, everything is exactly how we want it to be. We know how you see us, we know that you laugh at us, we know you find us offensive, and we don't care, or maybe that even motivates us. So this, once again, to come towards the end, raises the question as to the status of statements like these, and more broadly of statements around the masculine gangster figure. How real are they? What does real even mean in that context? Are these mere provocations? Are these deeply held beliefs? What are their consequences? Do people act accordingly? Are these cultural representations, as critical scholars in the United States have argued in references to images of tough masculinity in gangsta-rap, are these representations seductive, controlling images that lure young men, especially post-proletarian young men of color, into self-defeating self-definitions and into problematic careers because they make them believe that this is the most socially recognizable form of being authentically who you can be. So I don't think that these questions are really answerable. In my view, statements about gangster culture, street life, and pole masculinity are not necessarily a consequence of stable, deeply held worldviews as self-evident cultures or cohesive sets of practices, even though that may sometimes also be the case. But what they do is they take part in and more or less loosely refer to specific social imaginaries, in this case to what I would call an agonistic social imaginary, and they do so with various degrees of identification and commitment. Social imaginaries are, briefly put, imaginary representations of the way that the world works. An agonistic social imaginary construes the world as determined by struggles for supremacy and survival, basically as a zero-sum game. Everybody fights for themselves. Fight to live, live to fight is a popular tattoo. So man as fighter, as warrior, one way or another. In that view, power is also basically beyond morality. The success of the music and the styles and the identity projects that go with it suggest that this imaginary and the morality which it implies certainly exerts a strong attraction. Still, people usually don't fully subscribe to such views. Actual common sense, as Gramsci would put it, is much more contradictory. Now, what do we make of this social imaginary? There is, of course, a Marxist left-wing version of it, the class struggle imaginary. But politically, at this point in history, the agonistic social imaginary as it emerges from gangster and street rap is largely incompatible with left liberal and pluralist progressive worldviews. Those who aren't only aesthetically fascinated by this social imaginary, but who take it seriously, soon find that there is something oppositional to it, if only because most educational programs and multicultural policies that students are in contact with are implicitly intended to fight against this kind of imaginary, for understandable reasons. At the same time, and this is a key contradiction, I think, in terms of educational institutions, in urging students to fend for themselves on the labor market and by promoting neoliberal raise yourselves up by the bootstraps ideology, these very same institutions and the broader institutional frameworks in which they are embedded also help to make plausible this imaginary. So to ask whether or not people who listen to gangster rap firmly believe what they hear or say may be to ask the wrong question. Almost all of us are able to live with contradictions and with multiple identifications, and many may enjoy exactly these contradictions. However, the antagonistic repertoire and the modes of masculinity that go with it situationally allow people to live out one option among others. Managing these repertoires in different settings and situations is a key competency of contemporary subjecthood, including that of post-migrants, but not exclusively theirs. I think this diagnosis is confirmed in ethnographic research, for example, by recent studies by my colleague Stefan Wellgraf, and I've witnessed similar things, where it was observed that young people in schools and youth clubs, for example, are given equipment and workshops in order to learn musical skills, to unleash their creativity through the forms of hip-hop culture, including rapping, rapping workshops. And in these settings, many students will write songs about the need for unity within society and for people to take the straight path rather than the road to crime, and gangsterdom for universal recognition and so forth. Then those very same students will, in their free time with friends and others from the neighborhoods, use these skills they practice in these sessions to tell completely different stories, stories of gangster realism, thug life, street masculinity. And so, but the point isn't that they are lying in school and uttering what they really think outside of school. Rather, I think that they are proving themselves competent to act in a situationally specific manner. So doing all this relativizing and being inconsequential, as Bushido would say, this is not to say that the imaginaries to which these performances refer are inconsequential. For that reason, I would like to highlight two political dynamics in which these youth cultural developments are intertwined, and for which the showcasing of an agonistic social imaginary plays a crucial role, which leads us back a bit to the examples of social drama and their preconditions that I gave at the beginning of this presentation. First, the ongoing success of the gangsta-рэп paradigm as a prevalent mode of cultural visibility for post-migrant youth, and the near-constant evocation of this agonistic imaginary leads to a variety of social responses from what could be called mainstream society. From outright racism, so there's the widespread reaction, these, which you could of course easily see in YouTube comments, they are disgusting, these Kanaken are all the same, all they want to do is fight, they're completely worthless. You see thousands of comments like that. Then there are more conflicted but still troubled responses, including by other respectability-oriented migrants and post-migrants, also often by women who feel demeaned by these lyrics, and who in response construct good migrant versus bad migrant dichotomies, or make up culturalist or sociological rationalizations for the attitudes that they abhor. In either case, there are remarkable dissonances and forms of unease, especially among Germans who try hard not to be racist and who consider themselves progressive, between their general statements about the need for tolerance and integration and their reactions to gangsta-rap and self-confident post-migrant young men. I've called it embarrassment earlier in this talk. Maybe there's are better concepts. Secondly, while the gangster version of the antagonistic social imaginary has proven itself to be long-lasting and successful, its incompatibility with a more pluralist or solidarity-oriented imaginary has deepened the gap between much of the hip-hop-inspired youth cultural world, including that of post-migrant working-class youth, on the one hand, and left-wing progressive narratives and imaginaries on the other hand. The latter seem out of step with reality when compared to the agonistic social imaginary and its matter-of-fact morality. They seem unattractive when compared with their aesthetics. Pluralist or emancipatory social imaginaries are increasingly symbolically cemented as a culture of a segment of the educated middle class and of a smaller group of minority in the minority activists. Furthermore, the rhetoric of peace, recognition, diversity, multiculturalism, and solidarity, and the imaginary with which it is connected, is also associated, at least in part, with educational institutions that claim to be benign and to be enriching and recognition-oriented and so forth, while at the same time really preparing young people of working-class backgrounds to a life in the lower rungs of society, and people see through this quite easily. Now, this of course does not mean that people for that reason now collectively vote for right-wing anti-immigrant populists, they resist them, but Bushido for some time played publicly with the idea of voting for the AfD, for example. Then he said that he didn't do it, and that would be a strange idea, but he left the option, he toyed with the option quite a lot. So things are much more contradictory than that. Still, there are elective affinities and resonances between these different kinds of what I would call anti-moralism, and I think that they do play a role, maybe not the decisive one, or surely not a decisive one, but still a role in bringing about the current cultural situations in which we find ourselves. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Moritz, for this sophisticated report. I'm excited to hear your questions. Some reactions.
Would you like to hear an example of this gangsta-рэp?
I thought so. I feared so. Yes. Where should we start? On YouTube. Let's see. How do I switch to? Could you switch to the? Latin alphabet?